Hi everyone, so here we are looking at the nature of reality, and in this lecture we'll look at idealism. In particular, we'll look at Plato's idea of idealism and then Bishop Berkeley's idealism. So what is it? What is reality? What's the nature of it? The common sense view is that it's material, it's physical, right? A lot of our technology and the way we live today is based upon the belief that reality is primarily material. On the other hand, there are those who say, no, reality is primarily immaterial, that it's not physical, that's rather an illusion. And what reality is ultimately comprised of is immaterial things, immaterial substances. This will be our first objection to materialism. So remember the ideas that we learned earlier in our class from Plato. He has this allegory where he tries to describe to us his depiction of the human condition, that we are trapped in a cave, right? A false reality. And all we believe are shadows presented to us, shadows of the real reality. And if we were to ask questions, we could eventually possibly escape this cave, escape this false perception of reality to experience what's ultimately real. And for Plato, what's ultimately real is what is referred to as forms. Now, sometimes you can translate that Greek term where forms comes from to also meaning ideas, right? So keep that in mind too. Plato says these forms are the real thing, but these forms are not material. Okay, so what does he mean? These forms are the real thing. Well, let's take a look at a bunch of books. Maybe you can see behind me I have a shelf full of books. But notice they are different shapes, sizes, colors, textures, yet you can recognize them all as being books, right? Well, how did you do that? How did you know they're all books, even though they're all physically different? Well, it's because they all share in the form of bookness. Right? I mean, you know they're all books because they share the qualities of what you think a book is. They all have bookness to them. Well, where is that bookness from? I mean, Plato doesn't believe we made it up. Plato believes the idea of a book, the form of the book, right, exists in reality. Right? That idea of what a book is isn't something we created, but it's something we access. And it's because we have a memory of what is there in that more real world bookness that we're able to identify, okay, that is a book and that's a book and the other thing's a book, because they all share in the form of bookness. So he says there must be this absolute realm then, right? This realm beyond the physical realm where these material forms or ideas live. And it's that realm, that immaterial absolute realm, that reality actually is. I mean, that is what's most real. Because these books, they could change. You can tear pages, you can mark them, you could change colors, but the idea of a book is always there. The idea of a book is always constant. The idea of a book doesn't change. So that must be what's most real. So this realm of ideas or forms, says Plato, well, that's what's beyond the cave. That's what's causing the shadows that we experience. In this case, these books, right? Okay, well, let's try a different example to get maybe a more grounded sense of this. Hopefully, you recognize all of these as being triangles, but how do you know? How do you know they're all triangles? Well, I mean, hopefully you get a sense for where Plato's going to go. He's going to say these are all triangles because they all share in the form of a triangle. So when we take a look at all these triangles, we're accessing this idea of what a triangle is. But where did humanity get that idea of a triangle? How did we get access to the idea in our heads of what a triangle is in the first place? I mean, have you ever seen a perfect triangle? So you say to yourself, okay, that's a triangle, that's a triangle, that's a triangle. Well, you might be saying to yourself, well, I know it's a triangle because I know what a triangle looks like, right? How do you know what a triangle looks like? Have you actually ever seen one? Well, you might say to yourself, yeah, I'm looking at them right now. And I was taught what a triangle looks like from like school, right? It was in our textbook, or maybe our geometry textbook, that a triangle is, a shape with three sides, where when you measure the angles for each of the three angles in a triangle, it adds up to 180 degrees, right? That's what a triangle is. Shape with three sides, straight lines, where when you add up the angles within the triangle, it equals 180 degrees. But have you ever actually seen that? I mean, take a look at your textbook. When you take a look at your textbook and see a triangle, right, and it shows you, hey, this is what a triangle is, you actually had not seen a perfect triangle. So wait, how is it not perfect? Well, if you take a closer and closer look at those lines in the triangle, are they completely straight lines? Well, no, because it's pixelated, right? It's also on an uneven surface. That page in your paper isn't exactly flat if you take a really close look at it. If you take a look at the angles and you zoomed in, you notice that they're not perfectly totaling up to 180, because that image isn't a perfectly shaped triangle. Well, then how do you know what a triangle is? How do you know a triangle is supposed to be a shape with three sides that have angles up to 180? Well, it's because you were given the idea of a triangle. Okay, but well, how did the people that gave you the idea of a triangle get the idea of a triangle in the first place? Well, somebody came up with it. Plato's words is that no, they didn't come up with it. They accessed it. The idea of a triangle actually exists in reality. In fact, that's what's most real. And then we apply to all these things in our lives in the cave, and we go, that's triangle, that's triangle, that's triangle, even though they're not really triangles. The real triangle, the perfect triangle, does exist. It's just not physical. It's an idea that exists in this world beyond the physical. Well, let's try another example. Think about mathematics and numbers. You can't touch the number 2. You can't dig up in a cave and find the number 3. You can find a shape, or you can find a symbol or a sign that represents those things, but numbers aren't tangible. They're not physical objects. Yet they're very real to us, aren't they? Don't they allow us to do things in this world? Don't they have predictive value? Don't they seem to be very real? Well, they are real, says Plato, but they're not of the physical world. Numbers are things that we access through our minds. We access numbers through our sense of reason. Well, when we say we access them, where are they? Where do we go to access? Well, they exist in the real world, the world of forms, right? In the real world, there's the idea of numbers, that 2 plus 2 equals 4, that 4 divided by 2 equals 2, that 6 times 3 is 18. I mean, that exists in the real world, but it's not tangible. It's not physical. You can't dig it up, right? We know it. We can get access to it through reason. But notice, we don't get access to it with a shovel. We get access to it immaterially. Well, what ethics? We believe there might be some behaviors that are better than others. We believe that when people do things, right, we go, man, that's bad, or we should put that guy away, or we should punish this person because they should not be murdering kids. Well, embedded within our sense of ethics then is the belief that some actions are better than others, which means some actions are more good. Well, where does that belief in goodness come from? Where does the idea of goodness come from? How do you know that, giving to the poor or helping somebody cross the street is a good thing to do? Can you find goodness someplace? Can you dig it up and discover it underneath the earth? Can you measure and look at, at the sky and find goodness with your No. Goodness, this thing that is very real in many of our lives that dictate what we do, because you probably are in school right now for a reason. You think it's a good thing to do. That goodness is a real thing, but it's not a physical thing. It's an immaterial thing. It's this idea that really exists, just not here. Right? Otherwise, there is no such thing as ethics and morality, says Plato. There's nothing to access that would allow you to say you should not murder, but it's okay to help the less fortunate, right? Because that presumes something is better than another. Goodness must exist. So now we return back to what we looked at earlier in our class, Plato's divided line. So here we are living in our physical world of the senses, in our caves, and all of this can't be real, says Plato, because it's always changing. There's nothing real about it because it's always moving and in flux. Think back to our investigation of personal identity. When we try to find that I, we can't find it because whenever we look, we notice that whatever we are is always moving, always changes, there's nothing permanently there. So just as we saw with Parfit and Hume saying, well, then I guess it's not real. There is no you that persists through time. Plato says, yeah, this isn't real either, right? All the shadows that we stare at in our cave walls, all of the things we see in front of us, the computer screen, your chair, your shirt, I mean, these are shadows of what's most real, these forms, right? The idea of the chair, the idea of a shirt, those things are real. Those things don't change, he says. So all of the things within the cave, all the things within this physical world, this unreal world, I mean, they exist within time and space, right? What's most real is outside of time and space. And it's through reason that we experience it. It's through reason that we experience what good is, what we experience numbers, what we experience numbers. It's the reason that we experience numbers. It's the reason that we have a sense of a triangle and experience what a triangle is. It's the reason that we experience what a book is, right? It's the reason. And notice those things, he says, aren't changing. They just exist. They just are, right? This is the realm of forms for Plato. This immaterial realm is what's ultimately real. It's what's most true. Because think about what truth means for most of us. Truth doesn't mean something that changes all the time. Truth is how things are, not how things are becoming, but how things are, right? Isn't that what we mean by true? What is reality? It's how it is, it's how things actually are. Well, this invisible realm, it's comprised of things that are, that exist, right? They're not in flux. So what's in there? Well, these ideal forms or ideas. And notice that it's beyond space and time. It's not within space. It's not confined in time, which means it exists, in a sense, eternally, forever, right? Now, for Plato, there's this belief that then we, right, are not primarily physical, but in fact, what we are in reality is immaterial. We are souls for Plato. It's souls that exist in this more real world. That's our true home. It's where our souls are meant to be. It's where we are meant to be, is in this immaterial realm of forms, right? So he has this belief in souls. So to expand further in some of his works, Plato refers to the fact that we are trapped in this cave, enslaved in this cave, this physicality sort of existence, right? As a way of purifying the soul, purifying it to the extent eventually where we can escape this cave and then return to our true home in this perfect, eternally existing, immaterial realm of forms. Okay, so why does Plato believe in souls in the first place, right? He is coming after this line of Ionian naturalists that try to only explain things by looking at what they experience. And you can't experience a soul, can you? So what's Plato's argument for the existence of a immaterial soul? Well, he says, take a look at your bodily desires, right? You have an urge to eat. You have an urge to, you know, run at times from certain experiences. But are you a slave to those bodily desires? Every time you are thirsty, do you always drink? Well, no, you might stop yourself because you're in the middle of doing something where you don't want to, you know, leave whatever it is you're doing. Whenever you're hungry, do you always eat? Well, no. I mean, if I'm hungry right now, I don't have food in front of me. I'm not going to steal my neighbor's food because it's right there. I stop myself from doing that, right? And you've talked about this in your groups in class, about times you've prevented yourself from doing things. Well, says Plato, that thing that's preventing you from just doing whatever your body wants, well, that thing is the soul. See, there must be something more to you than just your body. Otherwise, you just do whatever your bodily desires dictate you do. He has another argument. Well, when we take a look, there are some human beings that we say are not alive. And then there are others that we say are alive. Same physical body. Well, what's the difference? Well, when we take a look at something like illness, we say, well, something causes the illness, right? I feel ill because I have something within me. I have an illness within me that makes me feel ill. Well, when we feeling warm or cold, there is something that's causing me to feel warm, to feel cold, right? I might be standing next to a fire. I might be outside and it's sun has come down, so the air is naturally cold. There is something that would cause me to feel cold, to feel warm. Well, then that must be true of the feeling of aliveness too. If you feel alive, there must be something causing you to feel alive. Just like there's something causing you to feel ill, like there's something causing you to feel cold or warm, there must be something causing you to feel alive. And whatever that is not in the person that is deceased. Whatever that is, we'll call it a soul, says Plato. And not only does it exist, but Plato seems to imply in some of his writings that it's eternal, right? The soul is a thing that makes you feel alive. Well, we know death is the opposite of life. And it's just logical to think that something can't be its opposite. So if death is the opposite of life and the soul is what makes us alive, then the soul cannot experience death because that would be its opposite. Therefore, the soul must exist forever. What do you think about these arguments from Plato? And I'll let you ruminate on this some more. But let's go back to this story of the divided line. As we mentioned in our last lecture, this should sound, or maybe the first year of class, this should sound very familiar, shouldn't it? That there's this physical world and it's kind of temporary, we're bounded by time, and we're kind of trapped in here, but beyond this is something immaterial, that's something eternal, that's something that existed forever and will exist forever, that's perfect, right? Does this sound familiar at all? Well, let's think back to Christian theology. As we mentioned, the Christian New Testament was written in Greek. You can imagine that the culture that these stories and books were written, were their Greek-speaking cultures, Greek-writing cultures. So it was written in Greek. They were very aware of Platonism. They were very aware of Plato's philosophy. But when we take a look at the Christian Bible as a whole, we take a look at what they refer to as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, right? There really isn't any explicit mention of an eternal soul, a soul that lasts forever. When we take a look at the New Testament, we see Christ speak a lot about, eternal life. We see lots of references to the kingdom of heaven. But the references to eternal life, are they necessarily about a life that exists forever? Or is that a term that refers to the quality of a life? One that's not bounded, the one that feels unbounded, one that feels unrestricted, that sort of experience of life. Have you ever had that feeling of being freed from restriction? Kingdom of heaven. There's not really much within the New Testament from Christ specifically where he talks about the kingdom of heaven as being something that lasts forever or that's immaterial. Instead, he uses analogies or metaphors like it's a mustard seed that grows into a great tree. Well, notice that that's process, that's change. That's not something that exists forever as permanent. But as people start to try to understand the New Testament and try to understand these terms about eternal life and these terms about the soul and terms about the kingdom of heaven, people would start to interpret them from their lens. And within being infused with Greek culture, that's what their lens was. So a lot of Christian theology, meaning the way people often interpreted, the New Testament, was filtered through this Platonic lens. Okay, so what do you think? Can you think of any critiques to Plato's arguments about the existence of a soul, that there has to exist some eternal realm, right? You might say to yourself, well, okay, look, we didn't grab an idea. The ideas didn't exist before we thought of them. We created the ideas. Okay, you could say that, but is that necessarily true? You could say to yourself, well, look, we don't need a soul to explain why we're able to go against our body's wishes to eat something right now. We can explain that through physical terms, right? We can explain that through chemical reactions in the brain. Death and life, the difference doesn't have to be some immaterial soul. It can be explained by biological processes, right? All of this, which can be explained through science. So as we mentioned last time, from Plato, we have in Western culture the strong belief in an immaterial world and a soul. And, once we get to the scientific revolution of the 17th century, that starts to change a little bit in the West. And people now start to become more materialistic because science is only looking at the material world. Well, what happens as you become more materialistic? What happens when we become more into the philosophy of materialism? Well, the whole notion of souls might be pushed aside, and so might the whole notion of a perfect immaterial world. And if you are religious, that might also mean pushed aside is your notion of God, because God can't be seen, can't be touched. It can't be an experiment to find or to learn more about God through the scientific, right? So you can imagine that the religious community, how they may have felt as the scientific revolution became in full prominence and materialism became more popular. Well, this leads us to Bishop Berkeley, who you read for today, right? Take note of his profession. He is a bishop. Well, Bishop Berkeley, within what the readings for today, he posits this philosophy of reality that is termed idealism. So what is this thing, right? Usually in class, we break up into groups and I ask you to answer the following question. What is idealism and what is Berkeley's argument for it? Right? So this could possibly be a short midterm question, so keep that in mind. What is idealism? What is Berkeley's argument for believing it? What do you see here? Hopefully you say a chair, right? And it's what you see behind me that I'm sitting on right now. It's a chair. See me move? Chair. Okay, well, what is a chair? You might say to yourself, okay, it's something you sit on, it has four legs, sometimes has like a backrest. But when you are being scientific, right, you're using your senses to get a sense for reality. So if I show you the chair, right, so there it is right there, what is it? Well, Berkeley would say that thing you are experiencing is a collection of sensations because that's how you know about it, right? Scientifically, how you know about the world, through your experience of it. Well, what do you experience of it? Well, you experience certain sensations of this thing, right? So I can feel my handle, and I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm hitting the handle of my chair, so it has a certain sound to it. You can see the color, it's like a beige color to it. I can feel that sensation of roughness because of the material, and then I can smell it. And because somebody was sweating earlier, this might smell not too good. Well, I mean, that's how I know of a chair. I mean, that's what a chair is to me, right? Is those sensations. That's what a chair is. If you're being a scientist about this, right? If you're being scientific about this. So notice what Berkeley's doing. He's trying to use the same method of inquiry, the same way of approaching knowledge that science is used, which eventually led lots of people away from God. And Berkeley's using the same method now to try to explain his philosophy. Okay, so this chair must then just be a collection of sensations, right? It's what you experience, a collection of sensations that we label chair. Where is he going with this? First premise, physical objects, whatever you want to look at, apples, tables, chairs, they are sensible things. They are things you can sense, right? Because if you're being a scientist, you can only know what you experience through your senses. So those physical objects that we're testing and doing experiments, all of these things, they're sensible things. They're things we experience with our senses. Well, premise 2, sensible things, they're a collection of sensible properties, right? So this chair, you know it, I know it, as a collection of what I sense of it, right? I mean, the only other thing I can know is the idea of it, but we want to stray away from ideas so far because we're scientists. We just want to know what we can sense. And when we sense the chair, what we mean is that chair then is just a collection of sensible properties of a certain smell, a certain color, a certain texture when we rub it with our hands, right? A certain sound when we hit it. I mean, that's what a chair is to us. Isn't that true of all things? They're just collections of sensible properties. But think about what sensible properties are. So when I look at this, I see the color beige. When I feel it, I feel roughness, right? When I smell it, I smell a particular odor. But that odor, that feeling of the material, and then this color of beigeness, I mean, those are just ideas, aren't they? They're just ideas in my own mind. This is a very important point. Think about that one more time. Berkeley says all physical things are a collection of sensible, all physical things are sensible things, right? They're things you can sense. And all sensible things, by definition, right? Those sensible things are collections of sensible properties. That's how we know the thing, is because of what we sense of it, because of the properties that we sense. Its texture, its color, the sound it makes, right? The feeling of it, the smell of it. Those are sensible properties, but those properties, they're not out there. Those properties are in here. Those properties, they are ideas in our own minds, aren't they? There's no feeling of roughness out there. There's no feeling of color out there. There's no feeling of a certain odor out there. No, it's in me. I'm the one experiencing those things. That odor is what I experience in my mind. Those are ideas. When I see the color beige exists in my mind. Those are ideas in my own mind. Therefore, says Berkeley, physical objects are sensible ideas. So the only thing that exists must be ideas, right? Because if you're being a true scientist, you can't say something physical exists because you don't experience something physical outside of yourself. The only thing you ever experience are ideas within your own mind. That might be hard for you to grasp for a second. So let's take a look at Berkeley's other argument. Because when we see this argument laid out for us, we may go, no, 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 no. Those ideas aren't in my mind, right? The color is out there. That odor is out there. That feeling is out in the world, isn't it? Well, this is what he argues against when he talks about the experience of water in the reading. So, premise number 1, all degrees of heat are equally real. So when you experience something that's really hot, I mean, that's real. When you experience something that's really cold, I mean, that experience is real. If you experience something that's like lukewarm, I mean, that's real, right? So all degrees of heat are equally real. But based upon what he demonstrated with the water, the experience of water, intense heat or cold is only in the mind, isn't it? I mean, you walk into a room and you might go, "Oh man, it's kind of cold in here, right? It's a little cold in here." But then you go outside in wintertime, and it's really freezing. So you go, "Oh man, it's like much colder outside." But then you come back into the same room that hasn't changed temperature, and you go, "Oh, I guess this isn't so bad. This feels warm now." But wait a minute, that room didn't change, right? But now your experience of the temperature of the room is different. So that means your experience of heat doesn't exist out there. It exists in you, right? It's within you that that experience resides. Because nobody changed the temperature in the room when you came back in, but now you experience it differently. That sensation is in you. It's in your mind. You put your hand in a bucket of water. You go, oh man, that's like really cold. Then you put your hand in a bucket of ice water. You go, that's way colder. And then you put your hand back in the original bucket. You go, oh, that's warm now. And that experience of warmth must then not exist in the bucket. That experience of warmth exists in your mind, not in the external world. Right? So premise 3, all degrees of heat exist only in the mind. Therefore, the only things that exist in our mind. And this goes true for any sensation, right? Colors, taste, sound. Something might sound loud to you at first, right? And then you go to a big concert, turn up the radio really loud in the next room and come back, and that sound it's not very loud anymore. Even though it didn't change, well, then that experience of that sound existed in your mind, right? It's not in the world, it's in your mind. So do we see what Berkeley is getting at here? Berkeley is saying something about the nature of reality. Hey, science, and this is paraphrasing what Berkeley might say to science, right? Hey, science, if knowledge is based on sense experience, we can't claim that there exists anything physical outside the mind. Wait, why again? Why can't we claim something physical exists outside the mind? Well, because if you are being a scientist about this, you can only say what's real is what you experience. But you never experience something outside of your mind. You only experience what's in your mind. The only thing you have access to are the ideas in your head. And if you're being a real scientist about this and you're only going to believe what exists is what you sense, well, the only thing you ever sense are your own sensations, are the sensations in your mind. So then those sensations, those ideas, those must be what's real, because those are the only things you ever have direct experience of. Berkeley's most famous quote is the following: Esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. What exists is something that exists in the mind. So the only thing that exists are ideas, and nothing exists independently of the mind. Because if we're going to be real scientists about this and only follow what we experience, we only experience mind things. We just assume something's outside causing that experience, but we have no basis to assume that. So you're sitting right now in front of the screen and you're looking, and then you say to yourself, well, there's a computer here that's causing me to have certain sensations, certain sounds. But Berkeley says you have no proof that there is a computer outside of yourself causing you to have those sensations, because the only thing you ever experience are those sensations. It is an assumption that you are making that there must be something outside of you that's causing those sensations, something physical. Berkeley says you have no proof that there's something physical outside of you causing those sensations because you never go outside of you. The only thing you ever have direct experience of are the contents of your mind. With one exception that we'll get to in a second. But wait a minute, you might say. Doesn't this lead to some really interesting questions that Berkeley's going to have to answer? Aren't there some weird conundrums that would come about if the only thing that exists were in the mind? The only thing that exists are ideas, and there is no objective physical reality? I mean, think about that. What sorts of issues or problems would Berkeley have to address? I mean, this is probably one of the most major ones. How can many people all agree about things like there's a computer here, or like, hey, instructor's talking right now, or we're in a house? How can a bunch of people all agree on those things if there's nothing objectively physical outside of them that they're actually experiencing? So if we're in a classroom right now, right, like a physical classroom, and we're all sitting in class, and then I ask you, hey, did I just talk about Berkeley? And you all said, yeah, you just did. Well, how did you all have the same experience, right? Where you could say, yeah, you just talked about Berkeley. How could you all have that same experience if the only thing real are ideas in your own head? Doesn't there have to be then something outside, some objective physical reality, such as instructor talking about Berkeley, for all of us to perceive so that we can then agree? Yeah, instructor just talked about Berkeley. How does that make sense for Berkeley's idealism? Berkeley says, well, there's a good explanation for that. We only experience ideas in our minds, and it is a miracle that we all can agree that there are certain experiences happening right now. Those sensations in your mind must be very well coordinated by God. Because we have no proof that there's a physical world. We only have direct experience of our own ideas. So if we all can agree, hey, look, there is a teacher in front of us, or we can all agree, yeah, look, we're inside a classroom, well, then all those ideas must be very well coordinated. Well, then there must be a coordinator to it, right? God must exist. Wait a minute. If the only thing that exists are things in the mind, if if something exists if it's perceived, then what happens when I'm by myself? What happens when I'm alone and nobody's around to perceive me? Right? How do I exist if I'm not if a friend or a relative isn't around to experience me? Well, I mean, your friend or your relative might not be there, but God is. God perceives you. In fact, all of this, in some sense, are ideas in God's mind. Wait a minute. Just because we only have access to our own sensations doesn't necessarily mean that there's no physical reality, right? Just because we can't directly access something beyond our mind doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing outside of us causing us to experience, beigeness, roughness, strange odorness, right? Well, Berkeley says, okay, but you have no reason to believe it. There's no evidence to believe something's out there. So why believe it? Because we're trying to take this scientific approach, right? We're trying to use evidence. We're trying to use our experience. Just like the Ionian naturalists, we're trying to use experience and try to explain things through what we can experience instead of assuming things that we can't experience. But the only thing you experience are your own experiences. The you experience are the own sensations in your head. The only thing you experiences are ideas. This is what's referred to as idealism. Right? Notice the difference between Plato's idealism and then Berkeley's idealism. Did you hear the joke about Bishop Berkeley? It's not funny, but he died because his girlfriend stopped seeing him. So, what do you think of Berkeley? How would you argue against Berkeley? Could you say to prove that no, there's something beyond ideas? Well, in our next lecture, we'll take a look at even more arguments against materialism, in particular, something related, the idea of consciousness itself and the, the experience of experiences themselves. And we'll take a look at both those in our next lecture.